آزادی بیان،
言论自由。
Free speech.
It seems to me that the biggest area of concern around internet freedom altogether is actually privacy. I mean, if it's justified by national security or by other reasons, what it comes down to is public and private powers.
Yes.
Google knows an awful lot about you as well as your government.
Yes.
Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think the very obvious clunking threats to freedom of expression, like large-scale blocking, like the Great Firewall of China, in a way, they're so obvious. And also, actually, they are in many ways contrary to the private interests of so many in the internet industry. There is some checks and balances that naturally come into play against that going too far. Privacy is more subtle. The surveillance can go on behind the scenes. Most people aren't aware of what's happening, and it's in the private interests of many in the internet industry because they see targeted advertising and other ways of using that personal data they've gathered as the way to fund their operations. People are very reluctant to pay for access to online newspapers, to search engines, to social networking sites. So those companies largely are making all of their money out of watching the activity of their customers. Of course, as they are watching, they are able to pass on that data also to government agencies.
Do you think Google and Facebook are a bigger threat to privacy than, say, the British and American government?
I think they're all potential great threats. They are all gathering lots of data about citizens. They have their own interests in how it's used. So governments have a much broader range of interests, many legitimate. Private companies have an entirely legitimate aim in making profits for their shareholders. That's it. How governments in future might try to persuade those private companies to think more about human rights and freedom of expression and privacy, I think is a very important question.
But at the moment, the American government can go to Google or Facebook and say, give us what you know about user X, and you can't even tell the wider public that we've asked you for that information.
Especially in the light of 9/11, the US government now has all sorts of powers to go to any company, not just internet companies, and demand information about individuals, combined with the fact that most of the internet giants are headquartered in the United States and their servers are physically there. Their boards of directors are often very politically closely connected to the highest levels of government. Of course, there always then is going to be a threat that that information will flow quite freely.
But how can the ordinary Joe, you or I, defend his or her privacy against this combination of public powers, which have a range of reasons for wanting to access private information, and private powers whose commercial future depends on knowing as much about you as possible and sharing that with advertisers?
I think people need to think about both individual action and collective action. Individually, of course, you don't have to sign up to Facebook. I know it's trite to say that, but you can think about, well, what precisely am I sharing online? Who has access to it? How might they use it? A lot of activists have found when they've used these social media platforms, especially in the Middle East and North Africa, actually their own governments have got in on the act and managed to intercept the communications even before it gets to Facebook and work out what's going on.
This is a point that Evgeny Morozov makes, of course, that if the British government is accessing 500,000, who knows how many the Chinese government is accessing.
And this is something actually I think that's a very damaging long-term consequence of the surveillance mania of many Western governments. Those governments claim we're only doing this in the public interest, we have all sorts of checks and balances in place to control how it's used. Unfortunately, they're buying the very same technology that then is being developed and sold to authoritarian governments that have none of those constraints in place.
Often, sometimes by Western companies.
Very often by Western companies.
Now, in many ways, it's a classic liberal. But given that unholy alliance of public and private powers, threatening privacy and therefore free speech, because in a sense privacy is a condition for free speech, do you think the EU is right to try and impose stricter privacy regulations?
I think I certainly don't agree with everything the EU does, but I think in the area of privacy, it's absolutely right to say the private sector as well as governments have to be very careful in how they gather data in the first place and what they do with it. I think it is really not good enough to take the US approach in this regard, which is to say there is quite a strong Federal Privacy Act dating from the early 70s that constrains the action of the federal government. That is not where most of the problems come from. I think it really is a much broader requirement for regulation, and many internet companies are very unhappy about it, but I think in this limited case, it is right for government to say, in the public interest, we do need to constrain private power.
That raises the larger question on which you've written extensively, which is who should set the rules, who regulates.
And one of my concerns in ever going too far in the non-liberal direction and saying that there needs to be more state intervention is that if you look at the examples of how that has been done over the first 2 decades of the internet era, it's often been done very clumsily, with very little regard to human rights, really largely responding to private lobbying and to powerful voices within government, often from the security lobby. It has not been done in what I would say in the genuine public interest.
So who should regulate code?
I think in one sense the First Amendment and the way it's been interpreted in the late 20th century to say that code actually is speech. Code is the language programmers use to talk to each other and to express ideas, and the fact that it will then run on your computer is irrelevant, is probably the right balance. I think it would be extraordinarily clumsy, have all sorts of unintended consequences, and not achieve the genuine public interest goals that government have to try to regulate software companies and the production of software in the way that governments much more legitimately regulate, for example, the production of aeroplanes. That's not to say I think software companies should be completely free of any constraints on what they produce. And again, I think actually the European Union is going in the right direction to say that software companies should be looking at privacy by design, looking at thinking through how they'll protect the privacy of their customers and their users right from the design stages of their software. The problem is if they leave it to the other end of the process, once the software is out on the market and perhaps causing privacy problems, it's then much more expensive for them and much more difficult in general for privacy regulators to change anything.